Good evening, welcome. Welcome to the first religious broadcast, restaged here for the first and last time, potentially, here in Peckham. Delighted to be here for this memorable evening, which will reenact elements of that first religious broadcast and will tell the tale surrounding it, as well as looking at some aspects of religious broadcasting from after. I would say from before as well, but there wasn't really any before, that's the point. If it was daylight outside, you may have seen a plaque on the wall outside, which says that on this spot there was, in fact, there we go, on the 30th of July 1922, Dr. James Ebenezer Boon broadcast the first sermon by radio in Britain to the congregation in this church. Now notice the wording there, to the congregation in this church. So technically, although it's wonderful to be in the exact place where that first religious broadcast actually occurred 101 years ago, that actual place where he stood was 5 miles away in Blackheath. It's the only time I can ever really conceive of in history where there was a genuine church service that occurred with a packed congregation and yet no one leading the service. Instead, you had a box like this just here at the front, and from that and the gramophone horn, you would hear the voice of James Ebenezer Boon from Blackheath. He went up to the roof. That is the roof up here. I was delighted to be welcome to come and look at the facilities here before. That's the roof that James Ebenezer Boon went to wire up an aerial so that he could be transmitting from 5 miles away in Blackheath to the congregation in this church, but not just to this church. It was Britain's first religious broadcast, and therefore it could be heard, I would say, throughout the British Isles. But the limitations meant Coventry is as far as they could reach. But that was no mean feat back then. But let's wind back a little, shall we? Marconi, if you've heard of any name to do with broadcasting, Guglielmo Marconi is probably the one. 1901, he sent a message across the Atlantic. It was a very primitive message. It was just Morse code.
Listen to this, Kemp. Take the headphone. Can you hear anything?
Yes, there it is.
The letter S?
Distinctly, Mr. Marconi. Hackett, come here and listen.
The letter S there. One of my fascinations as well is those recordings you find of original pioneers recreating their landmark broadcast moments. That was Marconi himself, playing himself in a reenactment right towards the end of his life. In fact, he was just boarding a boat out of Britain for the final time, where he'd built up so much of his wireless empire. And a plucky BBC producer sent an engineer down to the docks and tried to actually essentially doorstep Marconi before he left the country for our final interview. And I believe that recording is from that. So Marconi was not the inventor of wireless, but he is fashioning it in a way and building on it and patenting so much that actually essentially he's working out how to make this an industry. But for Marconi, it was really all about sending messages from one to one place to another place. He was hoping that we would all pay money to send Marconigrams across the world. And that essentially, that one-to-one communication is what it really was to begin with. But you did have these plucky pioneers, and that's what we'll come back to throughout this really, is it's individuals having these ideas. And here's one of them. 5 years after that, Reginald Fessenden essentially gave us the world's first broadcast in 1906. Very primitive stuff, only heard a couple of miles off the American coast and in Massachusetts. And that first broadcast was known as the first entertainment broadcast because he played music. And it was also the first religious broadcast anywhere in the world. The first broadcast in the world, essentially, of the human voice was also the first religious broadcast because it was Christmas Eve. And he played Handel's Largo on a gramophone player. He played O Holy Night on a violin. And he read from Luke's Gospel for Christmas, the Annunciation to the shepherds. I think it's almost ironic that to this rather scared public who'd never heard the human voice really before crackling through, and they'd heard Morse code but not the human voice, the very first thing they heard pretty much was, "Do not be afraid," from the angels. And I think that's what they needed. Reginald Fessenden's wife needed to hear that as well, because she was actually meant to be the one reading that gospel reading, but in the world's first broadcast, it was also the world's first moment of microphone fright, where she froze in front of this microphone, not dissimilar to this here. And so he nudged her out the way and he carried on the reading himself. Not the last time that men will be nudging women out of the history books, as we will see potentially. For example, this. So a few years later, we're now in 1917. We're in the First World War. Gertrude Donisthorpe here. Same person on both pictures, I should point out. She is Britain's first DJ, essentially. You won't really find anything about her anywhere, because she's only technically Britain's first DJ, because she had an audience of one, her husband. Captain Horace Donisthorpe was training wireless troops by day in Worcester, and by night him and his wife would go to this field. They'd cycle to a field. They had these two army tents either side of the field. He would be listening in one with headphones on, and she'd be in the other with a gramophone player, and she would introduce and play records. And introducing and playing records, if that's not being a DJ, I don't know what is. Okay, so Britain's first DJ. There's almost nothing out there about her, but I did happen to find a recording of her in her later years here, reflecting on the phrase that her husband asked her to repeat over and over again to test if it was working.
A wonderful bird, the pelican, his beak holds more than his belly can. I used to say that endlessly for the radio. I don't know why. I don't know whether the vowel sounds, the consonants were any help. I was the first woman to speak over the radio, I think. First broadcaster. All the stations heard me all around, within the mile radius.
All the stations heard me within a mile radius. That was the reach of radio at this point. One man had an idea, though, beyond this. Arthur Burroughs. He wrote this memo in 1918 suggesting that we could use this technology for one-to-one communication to make one-to-all broadcasting. And he was working for the Marconi Company as their publicity director, and his bosses essentially said, no, there's no money in this idea. So why would we send these wireless concerts and political messages out there publicly if it's never really going to go beyond experimentation? And so it fell on deaf ears for now. Elsewhere in the Marconi Company, though, you have these two, Ditcham and Round. Captain Round, the chief engineer of the Marconi Company, Mr. Ditcham, his assistant, would sit there and recite anything he could find just to be testing the signal to see if it was working. And particularly, he would recite railway timetables.
I will now recite to you my usual collection of British railway stations for test purposes. The Great Northern Railway starts at King's Cross. The London and North Western Railway starts from...
And he would go on, reciting railway timetables. Eventually, this made the newspapers, and people were saying, well, it's very exciting. We're hearing these railway timetables being read from Chelmsford, but could he read something else? And so Arthur Burroughs picked up the phone and said, Mr. Ditcham, would you maybe read something else? Put down the Bradshaw's Railway Guide and potentially pick up, I don't know, a newspaper, for example. Could you read the front pages? Ditcham thought he should read the back pages instead, the sport. So they decided read the front pages, then the back pages, news and then sport. It may catch on, and indeed it has. So then you go into the early part of 1920 and they start experimenting further. What if we were to try music, for example? And so we have Britain's first professional broadcast singer, Winifred Sayer. She's the first professional because she worked in the factory next door, Hoffman's Ball Bearings, and therefore she had to be paid to come into the Marconi Company and sing the very first song on British radio, Absent. It's an ironic song title, Absent, of course, because she was absent while people could listen in at home. And actually that idea of being absent is something that comes back in that religious broadcast, I think. The fact that you don't have to be present to hear those blessings being sent out there via wireless. The first celebrity on the radio, essentially, was wireless still at this stage, is Dame Nellie Melba. She sings Home Sweet Home in June 1920. In a broadcast, the first public broadcast essentially sponsored by the Daily Mail, who of course have been friends of the public broadcasters ever since. And it all goes fine for the first three songs, and then halfway through song 3, it cuts out completely, and the thousands of people listening across Europe and out into the Atlantic Ocean hear nothing because unfortunately a valve is blown and Melba doesn't realise she carries on singing. The engineers, Ditcham and Round, quickly change the valve over And by the time they've finished it, Melba has taken her final bow, and they know they're letting down thousands of people who are listening. How do you get the world's premier opera singer, who's been reluctant to be part of this experiment at all in the first place? How do you get her to carry on singing when she's only contracted to do 4 songs? Easy, you say encore. And she does 11 songs in total. You can't keep her down, can you? But we need to get on to religion, don't we? So November 1921, at this point, there is essentially no broadcasting in Britain. The Melba concert was too successful. People loved it, but unfortunately planes couldn't land and ships couldn't dock because all they could hear was a soprano warbling. And so the government said, that's it. Radio now is only for military and professional usage. It's not for experimentation, it's not for entertainment purposes. America, though, had a different idea, and they were just getting going. So you get KDKA, the world's first radio station in Pittsburgh, in November of 1921. Within a month or two, they have an idea. The KDKA station engineers, one of them sings in the choir at a church in Pittsburgh, and they decide to decamp, essentially, for this outside broadcast. I think actually maybe the world's first outside broadcast, technically speaking, maybe. And they wire up the church in Pittsburgh, and that's the world's first religious broadcast, apart from Reginald Fessenden in 1906, really. The first broadcast service, you had Catholic and Jewish engineers disguised, essentially, wearing choir robes, mouthing along, not knowing the words to the songs, but they very deliberately wanted to blend in. They did not want it to seem as if there was any technical apparatus going on which, I should have said earlier, we are filming this evening, thanks to some wonderful students from Winchester University. And if anyone has any, I think what we have to say, if there's any issues, if anyone doesn't want to be on camera, if you're sitting next to someone that you shouldn't be sitting next to, etc., let us know and we'll make sure you're not. It's just for YouTube, thank you. They shouldn't be backs of heads, it's fine. Is that what they do on Songs of Praise? I don't know, I should ask. So, that's America. Back over here, though, not a lot is happening, unfortunately, in terms of radio. Just amateur radio hams are doing their thing. So Peter Eckersley, he is then tasked in February 1922 with starting Britain's first regular broadcast station from 2MT in Writtle. And this is only so that the amateur radio hams have something solid to listen to, because there's nothing out there on the ether. They want to just know if their kit's still working. So the Marconi Company are given the task by the government of saying every Tuesday for half an hour, very strict regulations. You can broadcast for 7 minutes, then you've got to stop for 3 minutes and so on. Very strict what you should do. But Peter Eckersley and his team, who've been creating air traffic control, so they're using wireless for a proper purpose. They're given the task on a Tuesday evening of giving us half an hour of broadcasting. 15 minutes of Morse code, 15 minutes of the human voice, and gramophone records and songs. Very quickly, Peter Eckersley gets a bit carried away with this. He starts breaking the rules. Forget 7 minutes and off for 3. No, he's going to carry on for an hour and tell dirty jokes and play gramophone records covered in jam with a hole drilled off-centre just to see what happens. Essentially, it's Kenny Everett and the Goons 50 years before you thought they were about. He even gave mock opera broadcasts like this one.
Rome. Now we're going to receive it. There may be some atmospherics. There may be some jamming. There may be some oscillation. Whew! But hang on, CQ. We're just going to receive it now.
So this is Eckersley pretending that he is broadcasting a full opera from Rome, doing all of the voices and all of the instruments in February 1922. Now, unfortunately, Arthur Burroughs, that man who had written that memo a few years earlier, asking if we could have some sense of broadcasting in Britain, he thought this was going to be very damaging to the potential of broadcasting. And he wrote to Eckersley immediately the next day saying, what in the world are you doing? It's such a fragile thing, this broadcasting thing that we have here. Don't do it. But Eckersley had another 200 letters saying, we love it, do it again. So every Tuesday he was on playing the fool. But Arthur Burroughs then applied for a separate licence, and 2LO London was born, the famous 2LO London, which ultimately would become the first station of the BBC. So you've got then wild broadcasting from Essex, serious broadcasting from London with Arthur Burroughs, and Arthur Burroughs still the publicity manager of the Marconi Company.
2LO Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO Marconi House, London, calling.
So that's the sort of sound you would hear if you had a radio set at this point. There's a radio boom in the spring and summer of 1922. And Arthur Burrows is still making sure that setting up, we have these demonstrations of what radio is and what it could be to try and sell radio sets like this one. This one's from 1923. It's got the BBC early stamp there, a crystal radio set. And so they would have demonstrations. And there was one particularly famous one in this place. Does anyone recognise this? It's Peckham. There you go. Peckham in 1922. You may recognise aspects. You may recognise people there. I don't know if you have any neighbours. Who knows? So there was a particularly notable Marconi demonstration, Marconi Company demonstration. Marconi himself was retired on a yacht at this point. He's not bothered about radio. But there's a Marconi Company demonstration in Peckham Town Hall. There it is. That was a genuine photo from it. And it's an event called The Miracle of Broadcasting. So yes, we are. Miracles and religion, we're slowly coming in to this building here. Okay, we're getting ever nearer. So Arthur Burrows, that man behind the idea of broadcast radio, the voice of 2LO London, he is there in Marconi House on the Strand in London, introducing artistes and gramophone records and that sort of thing, and it's being heard then in Peckham Town Hall via a table and apparatus and a gramophone horn, so people could attend. Maybe potentially, if you're local here, maybe your grandparents could have been there at that event. One person who was at that event was Dr. James Ebenezer Boon. And he came back with an idea, and that was, can we use this technology to transmit a church service? Can we go beyond the walls of Christ Church Evangelical here on the corner of McDermott and Reedham? And he applied to the government for a license. He set up all of his equipment here. As you can see, we've got essentially a gramophone horn here. This one goes straight up like a vase, unlike our one here tonight. We've got all of the different kit and wires here on the roof, the aerial. He applied for a license to the government. But as you've heard already, the government had a rather risk-averse attitude to broadcasting. Plus ça change. And they weren't so sure about this, and they said, no, we can't let you broadcast. They'd already at this point turned down the Daily Mail, who had applied to be a broadcast station, because the government said, no, it'd be too powerful to have a newspaper that's also a radio station. And that would ever be the case until the times are changing, ultimately. And that's where we are now. But only Times, of course, the Times Radio and the Times newspaper, the only ones, I believe, so far. But Daily Mail Radio, watch this space. They tried 101 years ago. They did actually do it, I think in 1928, they chartered a boat and essentially did the pirate ships down the east coast, and they broadcast. Unfortunately, they didn't have a powerful enough transmitter, so they just about reached a pedalo off the coast of Norfolk. But it was a neat idea for 1 week in 1928. So Boon was turned down. The government said it'd be it would be too great for us to let's start that again. It would be too much of us to give you a license for a church to broadcast, because if we let your church have it, every church is going to want one. It's like, waiter, there's a fly in my soup. Well, don't be too loud about it. Everyone's going to want one. It was the same idea, really. And of course, the government said we could, of course, never have the situation where every church is a transmitting station. Flash forward 100 years, one pandemic later, and we're all live streaming. So, you know, never say never. But Boon accepted that. He realised that it was not really going to happen. But 5 miles away, Blackheath, they are manufacturing radio sets in a place called Burndept Factory. There you go, that's the church here. And 5 miles away, you have that. Burndept Aerial Works, the wireless engineers. And what they would do is they would throw open those windows, and on Blackheath Common below, they would have people gather and they could listen to live radio broadcasts. They had a gramophone horn facing out of the window, and you could gather and you could hear the miracle of broadcasting. You could hear a singer from Marconi House, potentially in London, reaching you there. In fact, on one occasion, the technology failed, and the Burndept engineers were so worried about what would happen if they disappointed the hundreds of people on Blackheath Common. So they just got someone to sing just behind the window, la, 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 la. And everyone below went, it's amazing, it's like they're here with us, isn't it? And they were, you know. So, July 30th, 1922, Dr. James Ebenezer Boon gets in his Chandler motor car, and he packs some gramophone records of hymns. He's already wired up this very church. And he's been up to the roof from the aerials there. He's also, at this point, this church, at this moment, was in fact the home of Peckham Christian Union, of which Dr. Boon was the head. He's not an ordained minister. He is a medical practitioner. He's a medical doctor. But he runs the Christian Union from here. And with their help, they get the church packed on that Sunday morning. And Dr. Boon drives 5 miles away. And for that service, it comes purely through a gramophone horn that's just like the one that we have here. And so, with no one but an engineer in front of him there in Blackheath, Dr. Boon picks up the microphone and begins. 2FQ Blackheath calling. Blackheath calling Peckham and further. I greet homes in the north, the south, the east and the west. Am I coming through clearly? Welcome to our service today. I'm radiating this to you from 5 miles away. And we begin with a hymn. Please find in your hymn books, Eternal Father, Strong to Save. I shall now attempt to play it in via gramophone record, and I will hold the microphone handset to the gramophone horn. If you would like to stand, you may sing. I'm unable to hear you, of course, but I'm sure you sang beautifully. I've been asked to point out that that was a gramophone record of the Seti Temple Quartet and not the church choir of McDermott Road Evangelical, to whom I send blessings. I would desire you to send letters of appreciation detailing your location and the quality of this transmission so that we know how far this has reached. That being said, I have already received one message by wireless here at the Burndept Factory during that first hymn. This transmission has come through from a well-known summer resort on the East Coast. It reads, message received perfectly by great crowd on the seafront. Will take up a collection if it is desired. I should confirm we are not out for collections today, but I appreciate it and I am glad this reaches you all the way in that summer resort on the East Coast. And now to my sermon. Almost instinctively at this time, I turn to John 3:16 for my text, to John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Before I begin, I would like to make it perfectly plain. I stand by the Bible from cover to cover, all in, from the first verse of the first chapter of Genesis to the last verse of the last chapter of the Revelation of St. John. Now, for the moment, I'm not out to defend the Bible. The Bible can take care of itself, and I note in passing that when men attack the old book, it only ends in the biter being bit. Only a few years ago, a skeptic wrote from a certain room of a house in Paris that the Bible was antiquated, out of date, obsolete, that in a very short time, at the longest, man would throw it upon the world's dust heap and leave it there. And that house today is a Bible emporium. The room in which that man sat writing those words that I've just quoted is so full of Bibles you can only enter the room with difficulty. Well, as Robbie Burns says in Tam O'Shanter to Mateo, for God so loved the world that he gave his Son. I believe this is true. It is true not only because it is in the Bible, it's in the Bible because it is true. It is just recently a very worthy dean speaking about our empty churches said, or at least was reported to have said, that he had no doubt that sermons were dull. Well, if the sermons are dull, that's neither the fault of the Bible nor the fault of God. The man who can only preach dull sermons has no right to preach at all. There is nothing dull about the text that I have chosen. It's all about love. And there is no dullness where love is. Love is the greatest power in the universe. Could we but grasp it? Brute force against love has always lost, always will. Look at the world today. Nation upon nation on the brink of bankruptcy and ruin. All mark you the outcome of cruel and wanton war. In one word, force. The gospel is a gospel of love. You have the whole of the gospel in my text, and I've chosen this text because I see in it the three great verities of the Christian faith. Number one, the fact of God. Number two, the fact of Christ. Number three, the fact of future life. Now, first of all, the fact of God. Note this, the Bible never seeks to prove the existence of God. Written for man, it takes it for granted that man believes that already. It does not follow that just because our churches are to a large extent more than half empty, that men deny God's existence. I have neither the time nor the patience to discuss this subject with the man who bluntly and boldly tells me there is no God. The man who denies God's existence is an absolute outsider and should be treated as such. A danger to himself, to the whole commonwealth. The cry should go up, unclean, unclean. We do not live today in the poisonous atmosphere of a cold and naked atheism. We live in an age when all right-minded men and women are open to conviction and reason. People are seeking the truth today as they never sought it before. Now, an old man was one day asked if he knew so-and-so. Knew him, he queried in his reply. Why, I slept in the same church with him for 30 years. Let the story be taken for what it's worth. We can, with all truth, say this, that men today do not go to church to sleep. If they go at all, they go desiring something, expecting something. Dull platitudes from the pulpit will neither draw man in nor keep men in. The modern mind craves for great things and not petty piffles. In a word, men want the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's the whole word of God men want, not the half of it. When you begin to think about it, it's very much easier to believe that God is than believe that God is not and never was. The man who tries to persuade himself that there is no God goes through life, always and everywhere, looping the loop with his own intelligence. He begins nowhere, ends in the same place. On the other hand, the man who begins with the fact of God falls into harmony with the very laws of his being. The stars in their courses help that man along the way. Now, the fact of Christ. Now, Christ is a fact in history no one outside an asylum for the insane will deny. Men have denied God's existence who have accepted the fact of the historical Christ. They may have accepted the fact because they had to, but they accepted the fact, and well, that's the main thing. But Christ, a mere fact in history, is not enough. It is true that Christ lived. It's no less true that Christ died. It's just as true that Christ rose from the dead. If Christ did not rise from the dead, then my text is useless and worthless, and well might the great apostle write, if Christ be not risen, then is our preaching vain. Christ is more than a fact in history. Christ is a fact of eternity. Christ came from God and went back to God. The fact of the resurrection is everything to the Christian. Without that, nothing, and with it, everything. Thirdly, the fact of future life. Christ taught many great and far-reaching truths when he was upon this earth. He most certainly taught this, that the grave did not end all. Christ looked upon what we call death with supreme contempt. It was death by sin that was Christ's great and chief concern. Christ stands for all time as the great unveiler of the unseen world. In all his teaching, I note this, that while other men speculate and say perhaps, Christ affirms and says, this is. Hear him now and hear him as he speaks about the future life. You who are listening to me, where you are in the east of England, those of you in the west of England, those in the north, and you from the south, listen. Let not your heart be troubled. In my Father's house there are many mansions. Now in these days there seems to be a tendency in some quarters to decry the writings of the Old Testament. It's even been suggested we discard the old altogether, confine our attention to the new. For the life of me, I cannot see the reason of all of this. As a matter of fact, there is neither rhyme nor reason in any one part of it. As I said 10 minutes ago, the book is one, and one it is going to remain. Now when I tell some that I believe the Bible from cover to cover, they laugh. Well, the man who laughs last is said to laugh best. But when I tell some that I believe in the creation story as I find it in Genesis, they laugh. When some try and be clever and put that poser to me, poser as they think, mark you, when men ask me where Cain got his wife, they laugh. When I tell men that I believe what I read about Noah, Noah's Ark and the flood, they laugh. When it comes to Jonah and the fish, they go blue in the face. But wait a minute, there is a right way and a wrong way to read the Bible. The whole volume is a closed book if you've not got the key. It matters little to me whether God made the world in 6 days or 6,000 years. All the lesson that I get from the creation is this, that God made the world. Now, that God made the world is more likely to be true than untrue. In any case, the world never made itself. Until someone can prove to me that's not so, I hold to what the Bible says, that in the beginning, God made the world and all the world contains. Now, to ask me where Cain got his wife is silly. I neither know nor care. The lesson lies around Cain, not Mrs. Cain. When I hear Cain say, as he goes out from the presence of the Lord, that his punishment is greater than he can bear, I find in that matter for deep meditation and study. When I've mastered that, well, then I might give my consideration to Cain's wife, not before. As far as the flood's concerned, I do not trouble about the rain. If a man is drowned, it's of little moment to the man whether he's drowned in fresh water, salt water, buttermilk, or in a vat of beer. It was a flood. Keep to that for the moment. To me, it reads that it was a flood of the wrath of God. And the lesson I get from Jonah simply lies along this line, that Jonah brought a punishment upon himself for his own disobedience and very willful wrongdoing. I sometimes think the Old Testament reading is too strong for some people, that it hits too hard. These deluded people think they can get rid of the whole thing by simply saying, go, ostrich-like. They hide their heads in the sand. Oh, that some would just use their brains. Someone has said that just as all roads in England lead to London, so should all texts of the Bible lead to the cross. Well, of course, it will depend upon what the preacher's aiming at in his sermon. There is, after all, only one thing to preach, and that is Christ and Christ crucified. And all the Bible leads to that. It's the one thing in the Bible that counts. And reading Old Testament writing, this strikes me over and over again, that when you read something in the Old Testament, you often find its counterpart in the New. For instance, in the first book of the Old, I find my first Adam. In the first book of the New, I find my second. I find the ark as a type of Christ in the Old. I find Christ himself in the New. One door in the ark for safety, and all go in that one door, one way to the kingdom and to God, Christ, who said himself, I am the door. Now, the first Adam fell, the second Adam stood, the first Adam died, the second Adam rose again. In the Old Testament, I find Moses and the law. In the New Testament, I find Christ, and in Christ I find grace and truth. I find sin and wrongdoing from page to page in both New and Old Testament. With Christ, so long as sinful men and sinful women were put right with God, Christ met sin, battled it, destroyed it. That was his mission, and he fulfilled it. At the world's price he could have ruled the world and been crowned king. But this man who was called Jesus, God himself manifested in the flesh, chose rather to sit with a woman by the well who was hungering and thirsting for better things. Chose rather to meet men like Nicodemus by night, that he might explain the mysteries of his kingdom. Chose rather to mix with publicans and sinners in order that he might lead men to God. Christ came to seek and to save the lost. Men were lost because of sin. It's quite true that we're all sinners. But the great truth about sin tends to be lost in this vague generality. It's not enough to tell men that they are sinners, but men need to be taught that and taught what sin is. Sin isn't confined to wrong actions. Sin lies much deeper than that. It's bad thoughts, wrong desires, evil inclinations. And that was the high plane of Christ's teaching all through. Not only that lusting was sin, but that the look was sin nonetheless. If these things be so, it all amounts to this, that men could commit murder before they rise from their beds in the morning, cut the throat of a neighbour when they are lacing their own boots. And Christ went to the root of the matter. It was the heart. He ever sought to get the heart of man right. And that was his supreme ambition. That was his self-chosen task. And that is my sermon. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, we have another hymn to sing. I have a gramophone player lined up, and we will now stand to sing the first verse of O God, our help in ages past. The organist Spencer Shaw, who once again is not here, but is on a gramophone player. Well, may I add, to wherever you are hearing this, that this is not the same as preaching to a congregation. But I have no doubt that this has come to stay. This innovation commands a wide field in which to spread the gospel. Although it is yet to be perfected, I am convinced that this will prove a valuable means of bringing the gospel into the very homes of the people. There are difficulties, and no one will deny that. The Postmaster General will tell you that. The wireless companies will tell you the same thing. But if difficulties there are, they are there to be overcome. I'm not concerned with the secular side of things. The point to which I would draw the attention of the church building to whom I speak, the whole church of the living God, is this. In speaking to homes, I believe 100 miles away, this is the largest and the most unique congregation ever humanity has had. Secular concerts and good concerts of that are the order of the day by wireless, so could preaching the gospel join them? It seems to me no time should be lost. The church should strike out now and at once. If not, a chance will be allowed to pass by and pass, never to return again. There must be no squabbling in the church over this. The church must be united and must remain unified. It will never come about that every church in the land will be allowed to have a transmitting centre. It simply could not be done. Now, speaking for myself, it does not matter a brass farthing to me whether I preach a sermon by wireless again or not. That is the merest detail. All my aim is that one sermon at least should go out each Sunday by wireless, advertised, wavelength, etc. given, and this one sermon be as much a feature of the Sabbath as the London or Dutch concerts are today, and indeed as any other concert may be tomorrow. Now, I'm not a doctor of divinity. I do not believe that God's divinity needs any doctoring. I'm not a reverend. I'm not a very reverend. I'm not a very anything. Well, true, I have been called a fool, and the man who said that would never object if he was forced to put the word very right in front of it. Why, I'm not even an ordained minister. I'm a humdrum medical practitioner in a common or garden South London practice. Now, over in America, during the hearing of a certain lawsuit, a man was seen walking about the court in a very disconsolate fashion when a lawyer went up to him and asked, "Who are you in this case? Are you the defendant?" The man turned and replied, "No, sir, defendant. I haven't done nothing to deserve no names like that, and I've engaged a lawyer to do all the defending needed here. I'm just the man what stole the chickens." Now, I am not the man what stole the chickens, and I've engaged no one to speak on my behalf. As a matter of fact, I've done nothing. I can only happen to be the first man to preach a sermon by wireless, and that is not what I had in mind when it was agreed that I should speak. I wanted to prove simply that it could be done, and I have proved it. So we conclude the service with our final hymn. The church is one foundation, and I've been asked to clarify once again, this is not the church choir of McDermott Road. This is a record of the City Temple Quartet singing The Church is One Foundation.
Is one foundation, is Jesus Christ the Lord. He is His new creation, by water and by wine. For everything by water, God's is born in wine.
Very good, thank you. And we'll turn the on-air lights off. And that concluded the sermon. So Dr. James Boon then cycled home in his car, drove home in his Chandler six-cylinder motor car, back to the church here to see that actually it had been a success and people had heard his sermon from this very building that we are in now. And as he said in his words there, gladly he wrote down the exact words of his sermon and exactly what had happened and how he had done it in this wonderful pamphlet that's at the British Library. And as he said in that, he was under no ambitions to broadcast again, and indeed he didn't ever broadcast again. In fact, there was no religious broadcast then until Christmas Eve that year, which of course was when the BBC came along. But before we get to the BBC story, let me quickly read you a couple of the letters of feedback that Dr. Boon received a few weeks after. From Watford in Hertfordshire, he got this telegram. Last night I happened, quite by chance, to be tuning in my one-valve wireless set when I was amazed to hear the strains of "O God, Our Help in Ages Past." Later I received your address with remarkable clearness. Another wrote from Godalming in Surrey. I shall be glad to know if there will be another broadcast sermon next Sunday. There wasn't. Yours in gratitude and congratulations. Barkswell near Coventry. You'll be interested to learn that your sermon reached here quite clearly. Sevenoaks in Kent, the sermon was received by me absolutely perfect on a 3-valve set. Eltham, the address given in such a manner enabled me to concentrate on it much better than in a church building. Interesting. In St Albans, a man was sitting so quietly listening in that his wife was concerned at the unusual quietness of her husband. She asked him, "What's the matter with you? You're so quiet." He held up a hand for silence and said, "I'm listening to a sermon." "Good for you," she replied. "Glad to think you are finally listening to something that will be good for you." And Dr. Boon noted, "I merely mention these to show the scope of the work, to show and to prove that wireless for extending the kingdom is there if we can but use it." The Daily Telegraph wrote about it as well. The latest pioneer, they said, is Dr. Boon, president of the Peckham Christian Union, heard as distinctly as if he'd been among his congregation. "No longer need we tolerate a dull preacher, for we shall be able to switch on the inspired and inspiring eloquence of some prince of the pulpit. But," wrote the Telegraph, "what is to become of dull preachers? Who will go and see a second-class film if a Charlie Chaplin's available? Who will sit out a second-rate sermon when it's possible to subscribe," is the word they used, "to the best preachers as easily as taking out a book from the library?" So essentially they're predicting podcasting by a century. The final one I'll quote is from St Paul's Cathedral. A representative of St Paul's said, "I have no problem with preaching by wireless. In principle, I'm simply opposed to introducing sensational methods into worship, such as advertising. Needless to say, we are never likely to have a transmitting or receiving instrument installed at St Paul's Cathedral." Never say never. So, several months later, the BBC came into being. Throughout that summer, while Boon was broadcasting here, there were discussions going on at the top level. The government had essentially said, we will allow 1 or 2 broadcasting companies. We're a small island, though. They were looking at America, where people were just getting more powerful transmitting stations and talking over each other, shouting about their shaving cream or their motor cars, whatever it might be. And they thought, we can't have that. We can't have advertising, and we can't have many broadcasting companies. Britain needed 1 broadcasting company, or maybe 2. There was a discussion for a while. Do we have 1 in the north and 1 in the south? Because Manchester had their own one going on in 2ZY Manchester. Eventually, though, the Marconi company came together and said, look, we'll share our patents and let's just have 1, okay? We'll have 8 stations around the country in Newcastle and Cardiff and Glasgow, and other places would be installed over the next year or 2. But the first voice of the BBC was chosen to be Arthur Burrows, who was still broadcasting on 2LO London, still being mocked after every broadcast by Peter Eckersley from that little hut in Essex. So whenever Arthur Burrows would innovate. Burrows would go on and innovate. He used to have the chimes, for example.
2LO Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO Marconi House, London, calling.
You're right. And I pressed that button as if I was about to hear the Westminster chimes. And I didn't, but that's fine. Arthur Burrows, dong, 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 dong. He hired these tubular bells and had them there in the studio to do the time signal. That was essentially going to be on the hour, every hour when they were broadcasting, just a few hours each evening. So the next day after that, Peter Eckersley, still part of the Marconi company, but mocking him there in Essex, got all the scrap metal he could find and broken glass and bash, 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 bash. So constant mockery from Eckersley while Burrows did things properly in London. There is, of course, someone else who was very keen that things were done properly. Yes, there he is. Reedham himself, of course, son of a Presbyterian minister, and his first instruction on joining the BBC as general manager, his very first order, was that a vicar should be hired, essentially, a minister hired to give a Christmas Eve broadcast. And so there was. It was Reverend John Mayo, no relation, I have asked. And there's a very small picture of John Mayo there, broadcasting from that studio at Marconi House. And there were no recordings of anything in the 1920s. They couldn't record anything easily. So 1932, they gathered back a lot of the people who had been part of key landmark broadcasts, and Reverend John Mayo was one of them. So once again, he, like Marconi, like Mr. Ditcham, Winifred Donisthorpe was able to record his voice recreating, in his case, the first religious broadcast on the BBC.
I have just come from my church in Whitechapel, a great church situated in the midst of all the noise and the turmoil and the dust and the slums and all that Whitechapel connotes. And it is my privilege, by the aid of the wizardry of Mr. Marconi in this wonderful house, to speak, as I understand, to many thousands of people. Surely no man has ever proclaimed the gospel from such an extraordinary pulpit as I am now occupying.
Surely no man has ever proclaimed the gospel from such an extraordinary pulpit. Well, we know that yes, there was a man who had done that, Dr. James Ebenezer Boon, already forgotten at this stage. And there's no evidence that anyone knew about Dr. Boon once the BBC had got going. And indeed, you won't find anything in any history books that I can find about Dr. Boon. The only reason I found out about Dr. Boon, and I'd started this podcast about the history of British broadcasting, and I've researched all sorts of things. And one of my Pause for Thought colleagues, Dr. Jim, who's here, hello Dr. Jim, was cycling past this church one day. Would you like to briefly give us what happened exactly?
It was another pandemic thing. During the pandemic I did a lot of walking around. I lived just a mile away, and I walked the streets of Peckham and East Dulwich and Camberwell and the rest of South London for miles, and I came past here often enough, and I saw the plaque, and then one day later when I was cycling past I saw it again, so I took a photograph, and because I knew you were doing broadcasting, and I tagged you in a post about it, and that's it.
There you go, and the rest is literally history, which we're now able to talk about. So thank you, I'm delighted that you've done that, and indeed that you're here now. So basically, thanks to Pause for Thought, and good evening, Cole's here as well, and Ramona's here as well. Nice to see. We've got four Pause for Thoughters. And any thought for the dayers? No, that means that Pause for Thought wins, which we always knew. So yes, Dr. Boon, though, alas, seems to have been forgotten for the best part of 100 years. Apart from the delight, whoever put the plaque on the wall here, well done, good thought. If it weren't for that, if it weren't for a plaque, we wouldn't really know much about it, I don't think. But let's pick up the tale then, and we'll whiz through 100 years incredibly quickly. Forgive me as well that I've left out lots of landmark religious broadcasts, but just to give a few little snapshots of some key moments. And then after that, refreshments over there, try and get this working if you can, good luck to you. And indeed, even if you didn't want a refreshment, which you should, around the corner on a table in the other room there, I've got old copies of the Radio Times from 100 years ago and some old little books and things you're welcome to peruse as we go. And some new books that I've written, you're welcome to buy one. So let's have a quick look through then. So we'll start with a week after Reverend John Mayo. For New Year's Eve, Reith, who'd started the day before, December the 30th was Reith's first day of work, essentially, at the BBC. And he got one of his favourite speakers from the Presbyterian Church in London, Reverend Archibald Fleming, to really on the dot of midnight, the very first BBC New Year's Eve. You can forget the Big Ben bongs and Bryan Adams playing it, whatever. It was instead, you would have heard this.
This is London calling. Reverend Archibald Fleming, D.D. of St Columba's Church of Scotland, Pont Street, is going to give the first broadcast New Year's Eve address.
To be the last in the year 1922 to speak to you is a responsibility before which the most confident might quake.
Indeed so. And 1923 then gets off and running. That's really when the BBC accelerates. I mean, that January, it grows instantly. As New Year ends in 1922, you have 4 employees at the BBC. Within a week, you've got 10 employees, and it grows exponentially from there. Peter Eckersley, that wild broadcaster in his hut in Essex, he's still broadcasting from that wild hut, mocking the BBC in early January. In fact, at that point, weirdly, the BBC's licence hasn't arrived yet, and Eckersley does have a licence to broadcast, so technically at that point, the BBC is pirate. And Eckersley has the official licence. He hears the first outside broadcast on the 8th of January, an opera from the Royal Opera House, and is so inspired at the possibilities of outside broadcasting, how you can shine a light in the darkness and go to war zones and spread culture from all around the world. Eckersley instantly stops what he's doing in that hut in Essex applies to Reedham and joins the BBC as its first chief engineer and helps spread it, makes the BBC more of a national networked organisation. But early January then, you've got every Sunday Reedham continuing that idea. We need a preacher every Sunday. And essentially, he goes through his address book. He goes through his family address book and finds people like Gypsy Smith, Woodbine Willie, people that who's the war padre, and gets them all to do little mini sermons on a Sunday. The Archbishop of Canterbury is convinced to back radio because, of course, you need some sort of formal backing for religious broadcasting. It's not enough to just have random preachers. He's sceptical, though, the Archbishop of Canterbury at first. There is a general sort of impression amongst the Church of England that radio is almost sacrilegious in some way, potentially. Could be heretical. Reedham applied on behalf of the BBC to broadcast the royal wedding that spring between the future King of England and the future Queen Mother, as many of us would know her, Queen Elizabeth II's mum. And the royal couple were well behind their wedding being broadcast, but the Dean of Westminster was against it for the simple reason, he said, that we don't know who could be listening. Men could be listening in pubs with their hats on. That was the reason given. No royal wedding broadcast. Later that year, the armistice event, of course, which is tomorrow, essentially, that was, Reedham again applied to broadcast it, and again it was seen as too sacred an event to allow to be broadcast. And even today, we are now seeing just how precious this event is in the topical way of things. Archbishop of Canterbury then was convinced to back radio by one legendary dinner party when John Reedham invited the Archbishop and his wife to dinner at the Reedham residence. And Reedham, by this point, he'd only just started listening to the radio in late January. He'd had the job for 2 months, not bothered listening to the thing. But he was given a radio, and he had his radio installed in a bit of furniture. So Reedham very cleverly walked over, and while they were having dinner, essentially just turned on the radio, and suddenly music happened around them. The Archbishop was amazed by this, could see no gramophone horn and no records playing. How is this happening? But didn't like the music. And so Reedham instantly phoned up Marconi House, as it was then, and asked for a different song. He said, could you play a bit of Schubert? And the band playing just stopped mid-song and started playing Schubert for the Archbishop of Canterbury. So all request radio for the Archbishop. But that made him convinced of the power of broadcasting. So then you start getting the CRAC committee, they called it, the Central Religious Advisory Committee, working out what sort of flavour of religious broadcasting you should have, what denominations you should have. Nothing too extreme, they thought, so they wanted to get these things right. It was another year until they broadcast a service on the BBC for the first time. But in that time, you start to get actually little flavours of other faiths as well. This is the first Muslim broadcaster, 4th of December 1923, Sheikh Rahmatullah Al-Farouk, aka the Right Honourable Lord Headley, the famous Muslim peer, talking on his recent experiences at Mecca. So he was an upper-class Irish peer who was a Muslim convert and established, I think, the Muslim Society of London at the time. So he broadcast on the 4th of December. Now these, I should say, I'm also going to get to the first Hindu, Buddhist and Jewish broadcasters. These aren't things I found in history books as such. Essentially, this is me going through every single day of the BBC programme guide to see who I think were the first people of different faiths. So I may be wrong, I might have missed someone, okay? But it seems to me that this is our first Muslim broadcaster at the end of 1920. So in fact, the centenary is coming up any day, isn't it? It's quite exciting. January 1924, the first broadcast service on the BBC by the legendary Reverend Dick Shepherd. I've got a recording. Now, I've been to the BBC archives. I don't think they have this recording because I don't think this is from 1932 when they got people back in to record. I'm pretty sure from what I can gather in my research that actually the BBC microphone broadcast this out there, but they couldn't record that. But separately, because they knew it was a notable event, they had a different microphone at the same event, which was being recorded by the HMV Gramophone Company, and that's why it's a bit crackly, because I believe this is a genuine recording from January 1924.
On the second Sunday in each month, to be allowed to say prayers, to sing hymns, and to talk religion in the presence of any of you who are willing to listen. We count it a great happiness as well as a grave responsibility. It comes to us here.
He comes to us, he was going to say, at St Martin in the Fields, which is where he was the minister there. The reason they chose St Martin in the Fields, it was well known at the time for its war work, for its work for charities, and therefore it wouldn't be seen as too fixed to one denomination. It was very much a church that other people, irregular churchgoers, could feel comfortable in. And St Martin in the Fields had a solid presence for many, many years, and indeed still to this day, linked with broadcasting. Reverend Dick Shepherd was so beloved as the sort of radio padre that when he died in the late 1930s, there was a state funeral and 100,000 people passed his coffin. He was so beloved. So then soon after that, what do we have here? The first Hindu broadcaster is Siddhar Mohana Mitra, who was reading stories that he had translated from the original Sanskrit, and that was actually the first of many broadcasts he did over the course of 1924, a whole series really reading out his Hindu tales. Then you have, later that year, the first Jewish broadcaster. I believe, like I say, this is the chief rabbi, Joseph Hertz. I believe his great-grandson, I think, still does Pause for Thought today on Radio 2, I think. Maybe wrong on that one. So a notable broadcast there as well. And then we get the first Buddhist broadcaster with the wonderful name Christmas Humphreys. Oh, what a name that is. And again, this is an upper-class convert to Buddhism in this case, and he spoke on the history of Buddha. He founded the Buddhist Society of England, I believe it was. I think was the name of the thing. But it goes to show at this point dare I say, the acceptable face of different religions across the world seems to be upper-class white male, essentially. If you can find them converting, great, they're on the air. That's 1920s for you. Anyone know who these two are? We're going forward now into another 15, 20 years later. Anyone know who either of these two people are? C.S. Lewis and Dorothy L. Sayers. Okay, so we're now into the Second World War. And I think this is a big moment, and I'll just quickly express why I think it's a big sort of moment. Late 1930s, big change in religious broadcasting, I think for a few reasons. One, Reith left the BBC in 1938. Another, people like Reverend Dick Shepherd, he died, and those well-beloved radio reverends, like Reverend W.H. Eliot as well, very popular in the 20s and 30s, they were retiring. And also, you have them in the Second World War, and a lot of the regular religious broadcasters, who were often ordained ministers, were pacifists. And there's that sense of, do we really want a lot of pacifism being broadcast when actually we need to try and encourage people that backing the war effort is the right thing? So there was then a trend more towards lay broadcasters, lay people. Dorothy L. Sayers was the first. She wrote a notable play for children, in fact, called The Man Born to be King. And I've got the book. It's a wonderful play because it's one of the very first updates that actually take the Bible and don't do the King James version, don't do the authorized version, but they give it an update. And pages of it read like a Jimmy McGovern adaptation. We're ready for a new version, I think, have a word. But it's quite a wonderful play, and there has been newer versions since. But then she was invited in to give her own sort of thought for the day kind of moments. And she also got in then C.S. Lewis before he was writing Narnia and things like that. And his broadcast talks became his books, Mere Christianity. I've got the book, the broadcast talks, in the other room, and you can have a browse if you would like. Then you get a sense of those people who are writers and maybe not necessarily church leaders and religious leaders who are broadcasting. Then, of course, you go into this sort of era. We get, the thought for the day, Pause for Thought. The ancestors of those are programs like Lift Up Your Hearts, little daily, uplifting, inspirational moments. Thought for the day, Pause for Thought, they come along once you get that delineation of Radio 1, 2, 3, and 4. So like late 60s now at this point. There's that idea of broadcasting for the 70s. There was this big campaign about how we should change broadcasting. One of the biggest changes in radio, when you go, actually, we're not going to have the national programme, the light programme, we're going to do different sorts of music. Tony Blackburn, Radio 1, launching that in 1967. Radio 2, then essentially the light programme Radio 4 then is born as well. So you get Pause for Thought and Thought for the Day. The very first week of Pause for Thought on Radio 2 in 1970, you get people like a builder, a doctor, that sort of thing. And a bit like Dr. James Ebenezer Boon, you get a medical doctor coming in to give their inspirational Thought for the Day or Pause for Thought. Songs of Praise comes along when Donald Bavistock, broadcasting executive, he was the guy behind Emmerdale, TV Darts, and Songs of Praise. What a legacy. What a guy. Where would it be without him? And it was to fill the preserved, ever since the days of Reedham, Sunday was sacred for broadcasting. You know, you don't want to put too much excitement on the air because you want to get people to go to church, essentially, which of course then led to people turning off the radio sometimes, wanting to listen to Radio Luxembourg and pop music and things like that. So there was a preserved slot on television on a Sunday evening, and Donald Bavistock said, let's have some songs of praise, notably not words of praise, the sermons not so much, the hymns, let's have some sing-along hymns. And that's where that came along there. You flash forward a little bit later, and then you start to get, of course, more analysis, more religious, essentially ways of talking about religion that are not so much giving words of inspiration and senses of worship. And we have things like Heart of the Matter. And look, we've gone for pilgrimage as well. I've really flashed forward here now, but the present day BBC, the way you can talk about faith in very, very different ways. And I think more than ever, of course, we need to be safeguarding those opportunities to talk about faith and talk about religion in an accessible, exciting way in today's changing media landscape. And to conclude here, we've got sort of things like Premier Radio, came along in the 90s, live streaming churches, almost the exact opposite of what Dr. Boon did 101 years ago. Back then, this church was packed with people, but no one was here. In the pandemic, the pews are empty, and you have instead just one church leader up front broadcasting essentially via a mobile phone. And I've included sort of this image as pretty much the end of the century, I suppose, because I think this is notable. This is, of course, Justin Welby preaching at the Queen's funeral. And television, they say, was almost born with Elizabeth II, although it came along in the 1930s, then it stopped for the war and it came back again. But the coronation of Elizabeth II, many people, that was their time when they decided to get television sets, and it sort of sold television to the nation in many ways. And then her death, her funeral, broadcast around the world, and they say that the viewing figures for that was the only broadcast, potentially, if the numbers are right, and it's a bit of guesswork, of course, the only broadcast that's ever been watched by half the planet in one go. Apparently, just over half the planet were watching at that time. And that will never happen again, of course. The way we consume television has changed massively. We now watch on devices in rooms, essentially, across the household as a family. But gathered around the set, there's never going to be an event like Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. That means that Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, effectively, potentially, his sermon was listened, the only religious message, the only religious broadcast ever heard by half the planet in one go. The only other time I can think of in history where a religious message was sent to half the planet at the same time was when God spoke to Adam. It's tenuous, but go with it. That's all I can think of. So, and then the future, you know, we're on the way here so I have a podcast about broadcasting history, the British Broadcasting Century podcast. If I may embarrass him, Roger Bolton has a marvellous podcast, Roger Bolton's Beebwatch, and only today I was listening to the latest episode of that, discussing the media bill and how the future of indeed religious broadcasting may change. You know, if the quotas aren't needed, what will we do about that? And of course, you know, as far as I'm concerned, religious broadcasting is a marvel. And I think if we need to change how we do it, if we need to make sure that we are making religious programs that connect with people in different ways, you know, I love the way that it's been brought into dramas, like Broken, the Sean Bean, Jimmy McGovern was beautiful. And I think we need to still communicate faith. Now more than ever, you can see that actually we need to learn how to coexist. And you look at what's happening across the world, and I think it's an opportunity to do marvellous things. There's a quote I thought I would sort of just end on that I saw that Marconi, who was anti-broadcasting for so many years, but eventually he worked out really what actually this technology could do. And he said this, he said, communication between peoples widely separated in space and thought is undoubtedly the greatest weapon against the evils of misunderstanding and jealousy. And if my fundamental invention goes some way towards averting the evils of war, I shall not feel that I have lived in vain. And I thought, absolutely, we have this great technology that we can communicate. It's an empathy machine, I think, in many ways. That actually, and people talked about this is the annihilation of space, the fact we don't need to be in the same room as each other to broadcast blessings or entertainment or whatever it might be. And, we need mutual understanding between faiths, between different belief systems, more than ever, I think. And long may it continue in many ways. That's about it, pretty much, I had to say. I can't leave without mentioning the book will be out next year with these four marvellous people. I have to mention Hilda Matheson because I have an expert in who loves Hilda Matheson, who has written a marvellous book about Hilda Matheson. If you'd like to know more, then Google Hilda Matheson and Kate Murphy. You'll find out more about them. But I love these characters. I love the fact they're innovators and pioneers, and all of those things really began all those many years ago with Dr. Boon. So we can raise a mug of tea to Dr. James Ebenezer Boon if you would like some refreshments afterwards. But thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us everyone. Good night. Thank you.